I feel my life turning. You drift from day to day. Years go by. Then a change comes. I am able to change. I can be a good person. What a strange thing to happen halfway through your life.
In Taxi Driver, the revelations disturbed you. In American Gigolo, the images provoked you. And now from Paul Schrader comes a story about the discovery of the spirit.
Everything you need is around you. The only danger is inside you.
The lure of decadence.
I have a strong feeling about this woman, a woman close to you. She will betray you.
And the chance for escape.
If I could do that, I could do anything.
What does that mean?
We could do anything.
This was not an accident. This person was murdered.
Am I in danger?
There's danger around you. It's very close.
A girl died last night. It's a cover-up. There was someone else there.
Damn you! Just get out!
Is there something you want to say?
I guess I'm a little worried.
You and I need to get our stories straight. Somebody's talking to the police.
Willem Dafoe.
Come with me. The two of us.
Susan Sarandon.
Sure. Why not?
Dana Delaney.
Oh, I remember.
What this feels like?
A new film by Paul Schrader.
Let's disappear.
Sometimes it's possible to change.
Everyone, welcome Paul Schrader.
Oh.
Hello.
So I love this movie. It's hard to believe it was made 30 years ago. I feel like you like to work in series of trilogies, and this is the third in your night characters. So what inspired this story, and how did you come to, into John Latour's life?
Well, a couple things. I've only learned two things in my creative life, and I learned them both in the same 75 minutes. In March of 1969, I was a film critic for the LA Free Press, an underground paper, and there was a press screening of Pickpocket, which was being released 10 years after in Los Angeles. It's only 75 minutes long. I went and saw it. And in that 75 minutes, I realized two things. One was that there was a connection between my theological background, I'd been in seminary, and my current profane existence as a UCLA film student. And that the connection between the sacred and the profane was not one of content, it was one of style. And that insight eventually led me to, a year later, start writing a book and then publish it on transcendental style in film, the religious and spiritual style in film, a book of theological aesthetics. The other thing I realized in that 75 minutes is I was living in a house with other UCLA film students, and they were making a film for Roger Corman at that time, a biker film. And I just thought that was all so beneath me, because I was a film critic. I was a protege of Pauline Kael's. It was that generation where we will tell you when you make a good film, okay? And that was my mindset. And so I had no interest or no ability to make a film. That whole idea of the commercial cinema just didn't interest me. So I went and saw Pickpocket, and I looked at this film, and I said, here's a guy, he writes in a journal, He goes riding around. He steals some stuff. He writes some more. Visited the girl who lives in the building. Writes some more. The police come and visit him. Write some more. I said, I could make a film like that. I could write that. And then 3 years later, I did. And that was Taxi Driver. That's all it is pickpocketed in a cab. And so from that screening, these two insights occurred to me, and I have subsequently followed them through. Now, Taxi Driver, which was a character born of European existentialist literature, Dostoevsky, Musil, Camus, Sartre, then translated into an American pulp filmmaking context. And so he wasn't so much my creation as he was I took a character from another tradition and brought him into film. And people recognized him in the moment he showed up and said, oh, we know what this guy is. And this is the underground man. And, and subsequently, I reverted to him. And I tried to do some glossy versions of him. I did a glossy version with American Gigolo, without voiceover, without narration, without an introspection, just all surface. And then I went back to going introspective with this film, and then I went back to the surface again with The Walker. The ones on the surface didn't work as well as the introspective ones. So then in the last several years, I've done First Reform, Card Counter, and the film which is shown at the New York Film Festival on Saturday, Master Gardener, which are in the introspective vein, which is like this character, you know, a man alone in a room, as I like to say. It's about a guy alone in his room wearing a mask. And the mask is his profession. And he's waiting for something to happen. And so that's the underground man. So that's where it all came. Now, how did this one come about? I wanted to write a story. I was 40 and I thought, I'd like to do a midlife crisis story. Because you're always thinking about what problems are rolling around in your head and what narrative metaphors will suit them. So the narrative metaphor for Taxi Driver is young male loneliness and hostility. So now I'm in a midlife crisis. And I can run through ideas and, the guy who leaves his wife and takes up with one of his students and gets a convertible and goes across country, all those cliches. None of that works. And then one night I was dreaming, and this was around 5 in the morning, and a character appeared to me in the dream. And he was a drug delivery boy that I used to know named John. And he was right there. I woke up like this. I said, wow, that's vivid. That was fucking vivid. He was right there. Why did I think of him? What was that all about? What did he want? I thought, well, he was asking me about what movies to see. I said, that's it. Midlife, 40 years old, drug delivery boy, has no skills, working for his boss, and his boss is going to get out of drugs and go into cosmetics. That's a midlife crisis. And I went right to my office and started making notes. And later that day, I tracked down the prototypes for the Susan's character and Willem's character, who were still at work in the city. And I called them up and said, could I hang with you? Because I'm thinking about writing something based on your characters. And Cynthia was her name, and she called. I said, "Let me get back to you." And she called me back, and she said, "I spoke to Bertolucci and Michael White, and they say you're okay." So then I hung with them, and that's how it all came about.
I love that. I love how you're inspired by Bresson, and I love your book on transcendental cinema. And I like how a lot of your characters are so deeply introspective and how they journal and kind of document life. And so I'm wondering, how does journaling fall into your own practice? Is it something you do? And does it help define your work now that you've looked back? And what's your creative process like?
I don't write journals. But what's interesting, what I found about journal writing, is that it's multifaceted introspection. Voiceover, in many ways, is like intravenous feeding. You plug a tube into the viewer and you start feeding them, and they can't taste the thing yet they're getting nourishment. And that's why voiceover has to be totally monotone and totally uninflected and totally kind of random. This is what good voiceover is. I got gas today. Gas was at 345. Last week it was at 359. I went inside to grab a snack. My brother had called earlier. My father was dying. I picked up a donut and some coffee. That's narration. That mixture of nothing and something, all sort of. And then when it gets really interesting is when you start going over the top of it. So like on this film, he's sitting there, he's listening to David Spade ramble on about God and the ontological issues. And you hear his thoughts. Now, is this a diary? Or is he just talking to you? And like in the film that is showing Saturday, Joel Edgerton and Sigourney Weaver, she starts telling him about the history of their garden. And also the voiceover occurs. And he says, and then she told me. And he tells you exactly what she's telling him. But when is he writing this? Is this something he's actually writing in the future? Are you seeing something he's written in the future? Now applying in the past? That's very dislocating. And so using voiceover to dislocate, to say it's not quite real. Life is not one-to-one. There's a distance between what you feel and what is actually happening. And that's where I think the narrative and the journal techniques really start cooking. And so they are techniques of storytelling, not so much techniques of personal expression.
What's your writing process like? Do you have like a channeled experience, or what's your day-to-day like creating?
I'm not a I'm not a real writer. A real writer, writes every day. Capote said you should write 500 words a day, no matter what, even if it's only letters. I don't do that. I am a binge writer. And so that I hold back, and then all of a sudden, boom, I write in a burst. So, and that's quite suited to screenwriting, because then you write something in a matter of 3 to 6 weeks. If you're writing a novel that takes 2 years, well, that's no business for a binge writer. And so, I know you can't be a binge writer and be a novelist, but you can be a screenwriter and be one.
And this film is really beautiful, and Ed Lockman shot it. So what was it like working with him and creating kind of, the look of it? And also Willem's performance is amazing. How did you find him for this?
Well, I knew Willem from Last Temptation of Christ. And the kinds of films I make often depend on people people you can put together. I knew Ethan Hawke, knew Oscar Isaac. So, because you're basically asking people to work for nothing. And so you have to be able to approach them directly, because they have agents and managers whose sole purpose is to keep you from getting in touch with their clients. And so, you have to say, Ethan, I've written something, I think it's for you. I'll send it to you if you're available, if you'll give me a response in a week, and if you understand my price parameters. And then he said, okay, on those terms, and then I send it to him, and then I get a response in a week, for good or ill. But if I send it to his agent, forget it, because that's why the agent is there. And so I knew Will, so I was able to go to him. And then once I get him, I started putting money together. And virtually all of these films are to some degree self-financed, as is not self-financed. Not my own money, but what's the word for it? Self-packaged, put together, like in the Beachville, no right-minded studio would ever finance these films. You have to kind of figure out a way to get them put together. And I've been fortunate in that, and I've been able to hemstitch a career of these kinds of films. God knows it could be a more high profile and a more a larger budget career. But they let me get away with these little things, and that's enough.
And what was it like working with Ed?
Well, Ed, I like a fairly clean style, and Ed is the master of gels. And so it was a kind of a friction relationship, because I like clean light and, no diffusion, none of that. So there's a scene in this film where he and Dana making love at the Royalton Hotel. And then Ed got to play with his gels, blue from here, green from there. But that was the only scene I let him do it in.
I'd love to open it up to audience questions.
Hello, Mr. Schrader. How are you?
Thank you.
I saw a video of yours where you mentioned your screenwriting process being problem, metaphor, and plot. And I wanted to know, does the problem come from, could the problem come from inside you, or could it be the problem, could the problem be something external?
Either way, sometimes it is internal, like taxi driver loneliness, the light sleeper midlife. Sometimes it's a larger social issue, that comes to play. And sometimes they meet. So you have, like in First Reformed, you have an existential crisis of faith. Do I believe at all anymore? And then you butt that up to a larger crisis of the existence of human life on the planet, climate change. Now you've got a personal issue. I've lost my faith, with a climate issue, which is the Earth has lost its faith. So that there's a nice melding. And similarly, the card counter. So which comes first? Usually the personal problem comes first, crisis. I've lost my faith. How can I keep standing up and saying something that I don't believe anymore? If you're a reverend, or I've lost or a card counter. I live in limbo. I live in a nothing space. I kill time. That's all I care about, is killing time. And then something happens. So usually it starts there, some kind of emptiness. And then it finds
an occupational metaphor, a minister, taxi driver, a drug dealer, a card player, a gardener. And I've written a new one where it's an RN, it's a woman, it's a nurse. And then you have the nurse and you have the problem. And then the sociological context enriches the problem. But I don't think that sociology comes first. I don't decide to write about Abu Ghraib. I just write about a man who feels such guilt that all he wants to do is be blank. He just wants to sit in front of a machine, pull this. He just wants to play cards. He wants to have no other reality. He wants to cover his furniture. He wants to not exist. He wants to kill time. And then you think, well, what makes a man be so blank? What has he done that he feels so much a need for penance? What guilt is he suffering of? What could he have done? You say, well, maybe he was a serial killer. Maybe he killed his wife. Oh, yeah. And all of a sudden, boom, Abu Ghraib. He shat out the nation's flag. He embarrassed his country, for which there is no forgiveness. And he cannot forgive himself for having done that. Now you've got something going.
Dylan, up here in the front.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, I've had the fortune of watching between all the various talks you've given on YouTube or gone to, a handful of Q&As over the years and gotten to listen to you speak. And there's not many filmmakers out there who get to talk as much as you do and get as many people listening across so many different, forums. And I was just wondering, when you step into, whether it's a university to give a course or whether it's here to give a Q&A or how is it that you translate what you're thinking into presenting to us? Are you showing us? Are you teaching us? I'm just curious.
Well, I began as a critic, and I wrote criticism and edited a film magazine, and then I reached a point in my life where nonfiction was not addressing my personal needs, and I had to jump into fiction, or fiction was going to jump into me. But those loves, a lot of my friends are film critics. I still like film critics, even though sometimes they say things I don't appreciate. But I like the profession. I like the people who do it. And I have a Facebook page, which is my outlet. Not really, it's just a Facebook thing, but occasionally I just made some comments about Athena, the Romain Gavras film. And so that is my outlet for these occasional critical impulses that I suffer from. The need to, I have a new one I'm sort of thinking about, I want to write something about. And so that's the kind of freedom to be a play critic. And of course, since critics don't make money anymore anyway, it doesn't matter. When I was younger, it was actually an occupation you could make a living at.
You've done a fair bit of writing, a fair bit of directing, and a fair bit of both at the same time. What's the experience like writing versus writing and directing?
Well, it's very different. Writing is very solitary. It's really alive, and when it's happening, it just takes off. When it isn't happening, the opposite. But it's lonely. Directing is the opposite. Directing is extremely communal. When you're writing, anything is possible. Night Amazon torrential rain. Boom. I can create that as a writer, just write a few words. You're a director, you say, night Amazon torrential rain, Well, there's $400,000 right there. But it is wonderfully communal to walk out on the set every day and have people there. You say hello, 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 and you sort of know a little bit about their lives, and that's wonderful. But it is very frustrating because you're always dealing with diminished expectations. You have a vision of how beautiful this is going to be, and finally you get something. Now, occasionally, lightning strikes while you're working, and all of a sudden you get an insight, and boom, and something occurs to you that had not occurred to you as a writer or as a director in pre-production, but all of a sudden now occurred to you to say, what if we do this? And occasionally it has happened where all of a sudden you say, pull up the track, give me 2 cameras handheld. We're going to shoot this dueling cameras. I've just changed my mind about the whole scene. Hopefully when that happens, you're right. Because you can't go back and rewrite that scene and say, no, sorry, it wasn't handheld after all. And then, so the answer to the question is the answer that Truffaut gave. And he said, when I'm writing, I like directing best. When I'm directing, I like editing best. When I'm editing, I like writing best.
Hello. I've read in some interviews that you almost seem to have a distinction between the films you've made since First Reformed and the films from before, and you sort of refer to them as like almost you had a moment where you realized around the time of First Reformed that you could finally make your movie, your Pickpocket. And I was wondering, what is the distinction between the most recent films and the old ones?
I was involved in a very unpleasant situation where a film was taken away from me. And I thought that was going to be the end of my career. And I thought they were trying to kill me because I was in a hotel in Los Angeles, and they said, if you leave Los Angeles, you will be regarded as having quit the film. However, you can't come into the editing room either. So now I'm sitting in a hotel room in Los Angeles drinking. What else am I doing? I said, they're killing me. These people are trying to kill me with alcoholism. And so I left. And the film went to other hands, and I disowned it. And I thought that was going to be it. That was going to be the ignominious final stumble in my career. And I remember saying to Nick Cage, who was in that film, I said, Nick, we've got to work together again. We have to remove this stain from our clothes. Well, I was talking about my clothes. Nick will never remove the stain from his clothes. And so a script came along, and it was a great script for him. And I said to the people, I think I can get Nick Cage to do this, but after the experience we went through, he will only do it with me if I get final cut. He's not going to go through this again. I didn't even tell him about this. And so they said, okay, we'll give you final cut. So now I had final cut. I made this film Dog Eat Dog. Well, now I had final cut. And all of a sudden, between final cut and the new technology, because the films I started making in the 70s ran about 42 days. This one ran about 36, 37. I'm now down to, the last film was 19 days. The film before that was 20 days. The film before that was 20 days. So you're making literally a film in half the time. But you're shooting just as much film because the technology, everything is faster. The light is faster, digital technology, everything boom, boom, boom. So now films that were not financially viable at 40 days are suddenly become viable at 20 days. So that when I got the idea for First Reformed, I said, this is the movie that I always refused to write because it was a career killer, because it was financially a disaster. But it's not financially a disaster anymore because I think I can, with integrity, say to an investor, I'll get your money back. Whereas before I would have just been lying and they would have recognized the lie. And so once I started to say, I can get your money back if you give me final cut, I'll do it at a price point at whatever, $3, $4, $5 billion that will get you your money back. Then you have final cut. And then the only thing inhibiting you is your own talent and imagination. Now, I've had that in other cases. Of Mishima, which is coming up, was a rare case where it's such a wacky film that no one knew what it was about. And in this film also, but most of the film, I've had functional final cut. But functional final cut is different than real final cut, because functional final cut means that you somehow have to make your master happy. Whereas real final cut, you just say, look, I'm happy to hear your thoughts, but that's all they are. And so, once I crossed that bridge, I felt free to do things that otherwise I would have self-censorship being the most potent form of censorship there is. I would have self-censored myself from doing things because they would be perceived as uncommercial, self-aggrandizing, too arty, But, once you have final cut, then it is that, So that's what made the difference. Dog eat dog.
Hey, I was just wondering about your role of improvisation in films, if you use a lot of that, or if it varies from film to film, or how you work with the actors.
There is no such thing as improvisation in film. That's a myth that certain actors and directors like to promote. What improvisation is really called, it's called rehearsals. So most of the things that you think of as improvisation are in fact rehearsals. Very rarely does something actually happen on the spot. And usually if it does, there's an immediately reset, recalibration, and then all of a sudden it's no longer an improvisation anymore. It's part of the new script. Occasionally you'll have certain moments like the phone booth scene in Rain Man where Tom Cruise passes gas and makes that comment live, I just passed gas, and then Dustin reacts to it. Well, that's improvisation. That wasn't scripted. Or a thing like Harry Dean Stanton in that little Grossbard film about money. Anyway, he's coming out of the bank. And he's going through the money they just stole. He says, look at all the money we got. 10s and 20s and 30s. And then he says, wait a second, there are no 30s. Now, that was not scripted. He just said 30s by mistake and then corrected himself. That's improvisation. Otherwise, what we call improvisation is rehearsals. So when Joey Pesci does that speech about shooting in the foot, that occurs in rehearsal. They're doing rehearsals, and during a break, Joe is telling this story, and Marty listened to the story. He says, that's better than the one we have in the script. Let's use it. Or Matt McConaughey in Wolf of Wall Street does this thing he does to warm up this vocalization. And Marty says, that's absolutely great. Let's use it. Those aren't improvisations. Those are part of the working process. Cassavetes, famous for improvisation, rehearsed day after day after day. But it is useful for certain self-mythologizing to call it improvisations, but very rarely is it.
Thank you.
I want to ask one final question. What's your fascination with psychics, and how did you develop that to like kind of carry this film forward?
Well, it was played by my wife in the film. It's just a touchstone to another life. And then, so it began, you see a little glimpse of it here, and then it started expanding so that in First Reformed, it became a levitation scene. And then in Card Color, it became this wonderland of Christmas. And in Master Gardener, it's a ride at night where the world comes alive and everything comes into bloom. And the idea behind these scenes is that there is another world than this one, and it's right here. And sometimes you can almost touch it and just remind the viewer that there's another world there. And these characters are trying to find it, but they can't quite find it, but they know it's there. And this is something that has gradually formulated itself, and now it's a part of my thought process in dealing with this. Is how do you relay the fact that these characters are living on one plane, but there's another plane that they aspire to.
I also love how all your films kind of thread and weave together. It's very beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us
Thank you.
tonight.